April 12, 1945. The Rhine frontier, Rhineland-Palatinate. Morning mist clings to cobblestone streets like a burial shroud. The air smells of ash and rust, the acrid residue of artillery fire that ceased only hours before. In the town of Bad Kreuznach, a child's wooden cart lies overturned in the gutter, its wheels still spinning slowly in the wind. The sound, a soft, rhythmic creak, is the only movement in a landscape frozen by fear. Inside shuttered homes, German civilians press themselves against cellar walls, clutching what little remains, a sack of dried potatoes, a photograph, a prayer. They have been told stories, stories that have calcified into certainty over months of desperate propaganda. The Americans are coming. They are destroyers. They are savages. They will burn everything, take everything, destroy everything. These are not rumors whispered in the dark. They are official warnings, broadcast in crackling radio addresses, printed in bold type on the last newspapers that managed to reach the provinces before the presses fell silent. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich, even in its final, sputtering convulsions, had painted the liberators as monsters. Joseph Goebbels himself, in his final broadcasts from Berlin, had described the Allied forces as Bolshevist hordes and capitalist plunderers, men who would rape, pillage, and erase German culture from the earth. For the civilians of towns like Bad Kreuznach, these warnings were not abstractions. They were survival instructions. Hide. Stay silent. Expect the worst. And so they waited. The sound came first, not explosions, but engines. The low, rumbling growl of American trucks, deep and steady, rolling through streets that had known only Wehrmacht boots and the thin wail of air raid sirens. The children, too young to fully understand the architecture of fear their parents had built, pressed their faces to cracks in boarded windows. They saw olive-green vehicles, massive and foreign, their sides stenciled with white stars. They saw men in helmets, rifles slung casually over shoulders, moving with a kind of relaxed confidence that seemed impossible in a war zone. And then they saw something that made no sense at all. One of the soldiers, a young man, perhaps 22, with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, reached into the back of a supply truck and pulled out a wooden crate. He pried it open with a crowbar, the nails shrieking in protest, and inside were not ammunition belts or ration tins. Inside were toys. Small wooden horses. Tin soldiers. Rubber balls. Dolls with painted faces and cloth dresses. The soldier smiled, called out to his companions in English, a language the civilians did not understand but whose tone was unmistakable, light-hearted, easy, human. He walked toward the nearest house, knocked twice on the door, and waited. To understand the shock of that moment, one must first understand what the German civilian population had been conditioned to expect. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a collapsing empire, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies shattered on both the eastern and western fronts. But the psychological architecture of the regime, the machinery of propaganda, indoctrination, and collective fear, remained largely intact, especially in the smaller towns and rural areas that had not yet seen direct combat. For over a decade, the Nazi government had cultivated a narrative of existential struggle. Germany, they said, was fighting not merely for territory or resources, but for its very survival. The enemy was not simply an opposing army. The enemy was a civilizational threat. The Soviets were portrayed as subhuman barbarians intent on exterminating German culture. The British and Americans were described as decadent, materialistic warmongers who would enslave the German people under the yoke of international capitalism and Jewish finance. This narrative was not incidental. It was central. It justified the war. It justified the sacrifices. It justified the atrocities. And in the final months of the conflict, as the Reich's military situation grew increasingly hopeless, the propaganda grew more extreme. Goebbels and his ministry doubled down on the horror stories, knowing that fear was the last tool they had to maintain order and prevent mass surrender. Civilians were told that the Americans would confiscate all food, leaving them to starve. That they would seize homes and force families into the streets. That they would arrest every man of fighting age and execute them as war criminals. That they would, most terrifyingly, take the children. These were not vague threats. They were specific, repeated, and delivered with the authority of the state. In the eastern regions, where the Red Army was advancing, these fears had a basis in grim reality. The Soviet forces, driven by a righteous fury after the horrors inflicted on their homeland, often showed little mercy to German civilians. Stories of violence, looting, and retribution filtered westward, feeding the propaganda machine and amplifying the terror. If the Soviets were capable of such brutality, the civilians reasoned, why would the Americans be any different? And so, when the knock came on the door in Bad Kreuznach on that April morning, the family inside did not answer. They held their breath. They waited for the door to be kicked in, for the shouting to begin. Instead, the knock came again. Softer this time. And then a voice, calm, accented, almost apologetic, speaking broken German. Bitte. Für die Kinder. Please. For the children. The door opened slowly. A woman in her 40s, gaunt and hollow-eyed, peered out. Behind her, 3 children clung to her skirt, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. The American soldier stood on the threshold, holding a wooden horse in one hand and a small cloth doll in the other. He smiled, not the grin of a conqueror, but the tentative, almost embarrassed smile of a stranger offering a gift. He held out the toys. The woman stared at them as if they were objects from another world. Which, in a sense, they were. Toys. In a war zone. Offered freely, with no demand for payment, no expectation of submission. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. This did not fit the script. This was not how occupation was supposed to begin. She reached out slowly, took the doll, turned it over in her hands. It was well made, the kind of toy her children had not seen in years. Fabric was rationed. Wood was rationed. Everything was rationed. And yet here was this American, this supposed savage, giving it away as if it were nothing. One of the children, a boy, perhaps 6 years old, stepped forward and took the wooden horse. He held it close to his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. The soldier reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar, wrapped in brown paper with English lettering. He broke it in half and handed a piece to each of the other children. They hesitated, looked to their mother, and then, with the universal logic of hungry children, devoured it. The soldier tipped his helmet, said something in English that sounded friendly, and walked away. This scene, repeated in hundreds of towns and villages across Western Germany in the spring of 1945, was not an aberration. It was policy. It was strategy. It was, in its way, a weapon, though not one that fired bullets. The American military, unlike the Soviet forces advancing from the east, had been given explicit instructions regarding the treatment of German civilians. These directives were born not from naivety or softness, but from a calculated understanding of psychology, politics, and long-term strategic goals. The United States, even in the midst of total war, was already thinking about the peace that would follow. And that peace, they understood, could not be built on a foundation of hatred and retribution. The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses, over 20 million dead, entire cities erased, a civilization brutalized beyond measure. When the Red Army reached German soil, they brought with them a rage that had been earned in blood. They had seen what the Wehrmacht did to their villages, their families, their land. And they repaid it in kind. The Americans, by contrast, had not fought on their own soil. Their cities were intact. Their families were safe. They could afford, both materially and psychologically, to be magnanimous. But it was more than that. The American command understood that the battle for Germany was not only military, it was ideological. The Third Reich had spent years convincing its population that democracy was weakness, that capitalism was exploitation, that the Western Allies were decadent and cruel. The best way to defeat that narrative was not with speeches or leaflets, but with actions that directly contradicted it. And so, alongside the tanks and artillery, the Americans brought supplies that seemed almost absurd in the context of war. Chocolate, chewing gum, cigarettes, soap, medical supplies, and yes, toys. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had allocated significant resources to what they called civil affairs, the management and relief of civilian populations in occupied territories. This was not charity. It was strategy. The toys, in particular, were part of a broader psychological operation. Children are the emotional core of any society. To harm a child is to commit an unforgivable sin. To help a child is to earn a form of moral capital that transcends politics and ideology. The Americans knew this. By giving toys to German children, they were sending a message not only to the children themselves, but to their parents, their grandparents, their neighbors. They were saying, "We are not here to destroy you. We are not the monsters you were told we were." But the shock was not limited to the civilians. It extended, in a different form, to the German soldiers who surrendered in those final weeks. Oberstfreiter Hans Mahler, a 24-year-old infantryman from Bavaria, was captured by American forces near the town of Würzburg in early April 1945. He had been part of a rearguard unit, tasked with delaying the Allied advance long enough for civilian evacuations to be completed. It was a hopeless mission, and he knew it. When the Americans overran their position, he and his comrades dropped their weapons and raised their hands. He expected to be shot, or beaten, or marched into a field and left to die. Instead, he was given water. He was given a cigarette. He was given a tin of corned beef and a piece of white bread. Real bread, not the sawdust and potato mixture that had been standard Wehrmacht rations for the past year. He ate slowly, his hands trembling, unable to reconcile the reality before him with the stories he had been told. "I thought they would kill us," he later wrote in a letter to his sister. "I thought that was the natural order of things. We had fought them. We had killed their men. Why would they show us kindness? But they did. They treated us better than our own officers had." This was not an isolated experience. Across the occupied zones, German POWs were processed, fed, and housed in camps that, while far from comfortable, were governed by the rules of the Geneva Convention. They were given medical care. They were allowed to write letters home. They were fed rations that, in many cases, exceeded what they had received in the Wehrmacht. And they were astonished. The contrast with the Eastern Front, once again, was brutal. German soldiers captured by the Soviets faced a very different fate. Many died in captivity. Many more were sent to labor camps in Siberia, where they worked under conditions of extreme deprivation. The survivors who eventually returned to Germany did so years later, broken and traumatized. Those captured by the Americans, by and large, went home within months. The symbolic object of this period, the thing that appeared again and again in letters, diaries, and memoirs, was the chocolate bar. It was small. It was simple. But it carried a weight far beyond its material value. Chocolate, in wartime Germany, was a luxury that had vanished years before. It was associated with abundance, with normalcy, with a world before rationing and air raids and the grinding machinery of total war. To receive chocolate from an enemy soldier was to be reminded that such a world still existed, just not in Germany. The American soldiers handed out chocolate with a casual generosity that seemed almost incomprehensible. They had so much of it. Their supply chain stretched back across the Atlantic, unbroken and unfathomably vast. While German civilians scraped by on turnips and ersatz coffee made from acorns, the Americans had chocolate, chewing gum, canned meat, white flour, sugar, and coffee. Real coffee. To the Germans, this abundance was not just surprising, it was ideologically disorienting. The Nazi regime had spent years telling them that capitalism was a system of exploitation and scarcity, that the democracies were weak and decadent, that Germany's discipline and sacrifice would ultimately lead to victory. But here was the proof, undeniable and edible, that the opposite was true. The Americans were not starving. They were not desperate. They were, in fact, so secure in their material superiority that they could afford to give away their surplus to the people they had just defeated. One German woman, interviewed by American journalists in the summer of 1945, put it this way: "We were told they were barbarians. But barbarians do not bring chocolate to children. Barbarians do not repair our water pumps and bring us medicine. We were lied to. About everything." But the transformation was not instantaneous. The propaganda had sunk deep roots, and for many Germans, the cognitive dissonance of seeing American kindness was difficult to process. Some clung to their old beliefs, insisting that this was a trick, a temporary ploy designed to soften them up before the real occupation began. Others, especially those in rural areas far from the front lines, simply could not believe the reports until they saw the Americans with their own eyes. In the town of Heidelberg, which had been spared significant damage due to its cultural and historical significance, the arrival of American forces was met with a mixture of relief and suspicion. The local population had heard conflicting stories. Some refugees from the East spoke of Soviet atrocities, while others claimed the Americans were no different. When the first American tanks rolled into the city's main square on March 30th, 1945, the streets were empty. People watched from behind curtains, waiting. And then the Americans set up a field kitchen. They began distributing hot soup, bread, and coffee to anyone who approached. No questions asked. No identification required. Just food, freely given. At first, only a few people came, elderly men and women too hungry to care about the risk. But as word spread, more emerged. By the afternoon, hundreds of civilians were lining up, bowls and cups in hand, their faces a mixture of shame and gratitude. A local schoolteacher, Frieda Hartmann, later described the scene in her diary. "They fed us. Not as prisoners, not as defeated enemies, but as human beings." I watched my neighbors, people who had cheered for Hitler just months before, standing in line to receive bread from American hands. And I thought, this is the end. Not just of the war, but of everything we believed. We have been defeated not by cruelty, but by kindness. And that is far more devastating. The ideological impact of this contrast cannot be overstated. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had constructed a totalizing worldview in which Germany was the victim, the hero, and the rightful master of Europe. The enemies, whether Jewish, Bolshevik, or democratic, were existential threats to be destroyed or subjugated. There was no room in this worldview for nuance, for mercy, for the possibility that the other might be fundamentally decent. And then the Americans arrived, and the worldview shattered. They were not plunderers. They were not rapists. They were not the harbingers of apocalypse. They were, in fact, ordinary men, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, shopkeepers' sons from New York, who had been drafted into a war they hadn't wanted, and who now, having won it, just wanted to go home. They chewed gum. They played baseball in empty fields. They sang songs and wrote letters to sweethearts back home. They were, in other words, human. And this humanity, more than any military victory, was what broke the spell. The toys became a symbol of this rupture. In the months following Germany's surrender, American civil affairs units distributed tens of thousands of toys to German children. Some were manufactured specifically for this purpose. Others were donated by American families, collected in drives organized by churches and civic organizations back home. The toys were simple: wooden blocks, rag dolls, tin cars, but they were given freely, and that act of giving carried a message that transcended language. In a photograph taken in June 1945, a young German girl sits on the steps of a bombed-out building, clutching a small teddy bear. She is perhaps 4 years old, her hair cut short, her dress patched and faded. Behind her, an American soldier kneels, adjusting the bear's ribbon. He is smiling. She is not, yet. But her eyes, wide and uncertain, suggest the beginning of something like trust. This image, and thousands like it, circulated through Germany in the months after the war. They appeared in newspapers, in American propaganda leaflets, in newsreels shown in makeshift cinemas. The message was clear: this is not a war of annihilation. This is the beginning of a new relationship. But the contrast with the eastern zones remained stark and inescapable. In the areas occupied by the Soviet Union, the experience of German civilians was fundamentally different. The Red Army, operating under orders from Stalin and driven by a desire for retribution, requisitioned food, housing, and labor with little regard for civilian suffering. German women lived in constant fear of sexual violence. Men were rounded up and sent to labor camps. Infrastructure was dismantled and shipped back to the Soviet Union as reparations. The Western zones, administered by the Americans, British, and French, were not without hardship. Food shortages persisted. Cities remained in ruins. Millions were displaced. But the tone, the approach, the fundamental attitude toward the defeated population was different. The Western Allies saw the German people not as irredeemable enemies, but as potential allies in the Cold War struggle that was already beginning to take shape. This divergence had profound consequences. In the years that followed, the Western zones recovered far more quickly than the East. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, including West Germany. The Deutsche Mark, introduced in 1948, stabilized the economy and laid the groundwork for what would become known as the economic miracle. West German children who had received toys from American soldiers in 1945 grew up in a society that was democratic, prosperous, and closely allied with the United States. In the East, by contrast, the German Democratic Republic became a socialist state under Soviet control, its people subject to surveillance, repression, and economic stagnation. The wall that would eventually divide Berlin was not just a physical barrier. It was the manifestation of two radically different post-war visions. And yet, the memory of those first encounters, the knock on the door, the offered toy, the chocolate bar, remained powerful. For a generation of Germans who had grown up under Nazism, the American occupation was the first real exposure to democratic values, not as abstract principles, but as lived practices. The Americans did not just talk about freedom and human rights. They embodied them in small, daily actions. One of the most telling examples came from the realm of education. American civil affairs officers, working with German educators who had not been tainted by Nazi ideology, began the process of denazification and re-education. Textbooks were rewritten. Curricula were reformed. But the most impactful lessons were not taught in classrooms. They were taught by example. In one Bavarian town, an American officer organized a baseball game between American soldiers and German teenagers. The teenagers had never seen baseball before. They did not understand the rules. But they played, clumsily at first, and then with growing enthusiasm. After the game, the Americans and Germans sat together, shared food, and talked, through interpreters, about their lives. For the German boys, who had been raised to see Americans as enemies, the experience was transformative. They were not enemies. They were just people playing a game. The symbolic power of that baseball game, like the toys and the chocolate, lay in its ordinariness. It was not a grand gesture or a formal ceremony. It was simply a moment of shared humanity, made possible by the fact that the Americans chose not to hate. This was, in many ways, the ultimate repudiation of Nazi ideology. The Nazis had built their entire worldview on the principle of hatred of Jews, of Slavs, of anyone deemed inferior or threatening. They had convinced millions of Germans that such hatred was not only justified, but necessary for survival. And then the Americans arrived, victorious and powerful, and chose not to hate. They chose, instead, to rebuild. There were, of course, exceptions. Not every American soldier was kind. Not every interaction was positive. There were incidents of looting, of violence, of abuse. The occupation was not a utopia. But the overall pattern, the dominant experience, was one of restraint and generosity. And that pattern stood in such stark contrast to what had been expected that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of German society. In the town of Nuremberg, site of the infamous Nazi rallies and later the war crimes trials, an elderly man was interviewed in 1946. He had lived through both world wars, had seen the rise and fall of the Third Reich, and had watched his city burn under Allied bombing. When asked what surprised him most about the American occupation, he paused for a long time before answering. "They could have hated us," he said. "God knows we gave them reason to. But they didn't. They brought us food. They brought us medicine. They brought toys for our children. And I thought, what kind of people do this? What kind of nation has the strength to win a war and then the grace to help those they defeated? We were taught that such people did not exist. That kindness was weakness. But we were wrong. And realizing that, understanding that we were wrong about something so fundamental, that is what broke us. Not the bombs. Not the defeat. But the kindness." The epilogue to this story is still being written, in a sense. The post-war alliance between the United States and West Germany became one of the cornerstones of the Cold War order and, eventually, of the unified, democratic Europe that exists today. The children who received toys from American soldiers in 1945 became the architects of modern Germany. Politicians, business leaders, educators who built a society based on democratic principles and a commitment to never repeat the horrors of the past. But the deeper lesson, the one that transcends nations and eras, is about the power of humanity in the face of ideology. The Nazi regime had tried to teach the German people that the world was divided into us and them, that survival required cruelty, that mercy was a luxury only the weak could afford. The Americans, simply by being decent, proved all of that wrong. They did not need to make grand speeches about democracy and freedom. They did not need to lecture the German people about their moral failures. They just needed to show up, knock on the door, and offer a toy to a frightened child. That was enough. April 12, 1945. The Rhine frontier. Morning mist. A wooden cart, its wheels still spinning in the wind. And on a doorstep, a small cloth doll, held tight in the hands of a child who had been told to expect monsters, and found instead a man who smiled. This is not war, she thought. This is something else. Something we have no name for. Not yet.